Welcome back to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm Graham Richmond, your host, and today I am joined by a really exciting outside guest. His name is Keith Bevans, and he is a partner and head of global consultant recruiting for Bain Company, and he's based in Chicago. Keith, welcome to the show. Really appreciate you making the time to join us today.
Thanks, Graham. It's great to be here.
So is it still winter in Chicago? How are things there?
It is shockingly cold outside, although it's nice and sunny, so it's very deceptive until you go outside and realize that the sun was just an illusion of warm weather.
Okay. Well, hopefully our listeners are all inside and toasty listening. So we're going to talk all about life at Bain, consulting. I have a whole bunch of questions. As you probably might expect, the Clear Admit podcast listening audience are, many of them are really interested in consulting. They're all heading off to business school, and consulting is a really popular track. But before we kind of dive into some of the very specific questions that I have, I just wanted to hear a little bit about your background and how you came to Bain, what you do there. I know that you have over 20 years of experience in management consulting, and that you lead the kind of global consultant recruitment. But yeah, let us know a little bit about your background.
Sure. I actually went to MIT for undergrad and grad in electrical engineering. Coming out of high school, I had interned at AT&T for a couple of summers, and I interned technical internships all the way through college. But pretty early on, I realized that I'd probably be better suited to being on the management team or running an engineering company than being an engineer. While it was great for 9 of the 10 weeks, by the end of every summer internship, I was ready to get back to school and leave the cubicle, so to speak. And I had also had a lot of exposure, both in my family and in reading different articles online, saying that, if you want to start a business, if you want to lead a business, you're much more likely to be successful with an MBA. So I had in my head that I wanted to go back to business school. And later in my MIT experience, I started hearing about consulting. I started meeting consulting. Since I stayed for grad school, I had some of my classmates that left after senior year go into consulting. And the more I learned about it, the more I was intrigued by the types of problems they solved and the types of skills that they learned. And then it happened. Somebody told me that they also pay for business school. That was the big hook. I said, well, I want to do that. I should learn more about it. And the more I researched different firms, the more I was attracted to Bain Company. And in fact, I didn't apply to all of the big 3, and when I got my Bain offer, I actually withdrew from first rounds for the other one. To me, the exposure and the people that I had met and what I had heard about Bain just made it far and away the best choice for me. So when I got the offer as a grad student, I was thrilled and signed up right away.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. And so you started kind of in the consulting domain, but then how did you end up kind of in this extra role that you have, which involves kind of finding talent for the organization?
It's a great question. So I did 4 years before I went back to business school, and then I came back as a consultant in 2002. Once I came back, like everybody at Bain, I have what we call extra 10%. So I had always been involved in recruiting. I had always been involved in training. When I came back from business school, I took on a leadership role with our Blacks at Bain, which is one of our diversity groups. We have 6 different diversity and affinity groups at Bain, and Blacks at Bain is one of them. And I led that for quite a while from here in the Chicago office. And a big part of the role in that capacity was recruiting and going to campus and helping to increase the diversity of the people that we hire. That was actually something I was pretty passionate about. And so I had stayed involved in recruiting for several years while I was a manager or while I was a partner. And then later in my time as a partner, one of the leaders at the firm said, this role is open and we think it'd be a really great fit for what strengths you've brought to the table over your time at Bain, and asked me to take on a role leading global recruiting for the firm. And that was in 2013, 2014, and it's been a fantastic run since then.
Oh, wow. Terrific. Yeah, I must say, I really, as someone who's done an MBA, I was at Wharton. I do remember folks from Bain and a lot of the other top firms coming, and I loved the fact that the people coming to campus to talk to us were the consultants, because you kind of, I don't know, maybe I was naive, but I went into that process personally just thinking, okay, it'll be some sort of HR person. They have like a hiring process, and it's not. I was actually kind of surprised that they took the time of consultants who were, all MBA grads or PhDs or whatever, and they put them on the front lines, like on the recruiting process. But it was really helpful, I think, when I was kind of attending presentations and things like that. So thanks for that background. As you probably are aware, consulting is really popular with the Clear Admit audience and in the kind of business school world in general. Why do you think that's the case? And are there certain types of people who are like a good fit, for this type of work? I mean, is there something about getting an MBA that fits well with consulting? I know these are kind of basic questions, but I think our audience is always interested in kind of understanding this stuff.
Yeah, it is very popular, especially at the top 15, 20 business schools where we spend a lot of our time recruiting. There are always a lot of students that are interested in consulting, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. First, it really does build on the broad experience that people are getting in business school. A lot of times people are going to business school to double down on an area that they were already working in, but a big chunk of the people that are going to business school are actually trying to make a career change of some sort. And they see a lot of value in being exposed to classes that run the full spectrum of different aspects of business, and they see the value in working with a really diverse set of people from different backgrounds that bring different experiences to the classroom and to the group projects, et cetera. And a lot of people see consulting as a way to just continue building on that experience. If you will, if you treat the MBA as a master's program, a lot of people will treat the consulting role as a PhD. It's building on the skills that they learned in that program and really taking it to a different level. And so I think that is attractive to a lot of people on the surface. The other thing that I believe matters a lot to people is they think about the roles that they can get and the roles that they want to sort of build their career towards over 5, 10, 15 years. And they see consulting as a way to accelerate that path. They see that people who come to consulting for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years end up in a role that tends to be more senior with significantly more responsibility than they would have been able to get if they had sort of worked their way up through a single organization. And then the other reason that I think it's attractive to a lot of people is it really is a chance to test drive the skills that they've been developing over the 2 years during the MBA program. Again, assuming the typical MBA is 2 years. So you sort of learn how to think strategically. You learn how to think about markets and customers. You learn how to think about the financial implication of your decisions. And you're anxious to give all of those a try really quickly. And they know that when they come to a firm like Bain Company, they're going to be given the responsibility to really use those skills in the real world and to help executives make the types of decisions that can reshape their company or reshape their industry. And that's exciting. The second part of your question was on the types of people that are attracted to consulting. And I know that the stereotype and the rumor that a lot of people say is, well, if you don't know what you want to do, go to consulting because you can see everything. And that's really not what we see in recruiting. There's always a segment of the population that's just heard, well, my mom thinks that I have a short attention span, so I think I should do consulting. Like that's more of internet message board humor than reality. What I find on campus is that we see a lot of people that are attracted because of the things that I mentioned earlier, but we see the types of people that come in. There's not one specific type. We don't all have the same hobbies or the same mannerisms or the same engagement style. What I find common about the people that I meet at Bain recruiting events is a couple of things. One, they're sort of relentlessly focused on learning, and they tackle problems with a tenacity that you just don't see very often. They take their ability to crack the problem personally. This is something very difficult, and I want to rise to that challenge, and I want to understand how I can help my client work its way through an impossible market situation, or how I can help turn around a business unit that is seeing massive turbulence in their industry, and they take that as a personal challenge. And although they take it as a personal challenge, they're also very team-oriented. Bain people tend to be the kind of people that want to win as a team. They want the client executive team to win, not just as an organization, but as individuals. They want to see them succeed. But they also, on the Bain side, don't want to be sort of singled out as the one who single-handedly saved the day. They want to do it as a team. And those are the types of people that we look for. I like to say, if you need to be the smartest person in every room that you're in, we're not a great place for that. We're focused on doing what's best for our client, not proving that we're smarter than somebody else or proving that we can think about things in a way that others can't. We actually like to work as a team. And those are the types of people that I think are attracted to what we're doing here at Bain.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I remember reading, I think it was an interview you did on our website a year or so ago where you mentioned if you need to be the lead singer, that's not really the right fit. It's a band and people are working together to achieve something. It's not, you can't take all the spotlight. I guess my next question is about the sort of changes. I mean, for example, when you and I were in business school in the kind of, late 90s, early 2000s, consulting was sort of going head to head with banking in terms of like top destinations for MBA grads. And, in the interim, there've been several years going by, we've seen a lot of, tech companies become major recruiters of MBA talent. And so, it seems like just as much as you might be going up against a Goldman, you're probably hearing about candidates looking at Google or Amazon or these other firms. So what would you say to someone who's kind of on the fence between starting off their post-MBA career in consulting versus directly into tech?
Well, I do think that you're accurate in saying that we see tech as a lot stronger of an employer for people graduating from business school. I mean, you can look at the employment reports of all the top schools, and the growth of tech and frankly, the decline of finance is pretty obvious. What I think gets lost in the mix is that consulting is actually growing too. And so while tech is growing and gaining share, it's not taking it from consulting, which is something that I think is often overlooked. Where we see tech's impact is at the top of the funnel, meaning the people that apply to Bain and to consulting. I can tell you 99% of the people that get an offer to work at Bain Company, if they're choosing not to work at Bain, they're choosing to work at another consulting firm. So I don't think that people are getting to the end of the recruiting process and going, I'm thinking about Bain or I'm thinking about big tech. I think they're by the time they get through the recruiting process for consulting, they're pretty sold on consulting. For people that are considering tech versus consulting, I think it really has to do with what you think you'll need to do to be successful long term. I tell people on campus every year that if expertise in an industry was all that was needed to solve the challenges facing that industry, the expert in that industry probably would have solved it already, and we wouldn't need consulting at all to begin with. And what I mean by that is, we believe that the breakthrough insights for any industry oftentimes will come by applying different learnings from different industries in a way that people in a particular sector had never thought of before. I like to think of a time when I graduated from HBS. One of my first clients back was in the restaurant industry. And we were, as part of that project, looking at the operations for different restaurants. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm a partner, I'm in our healthcare practice, I'm working for a provider that's struggling to improve its operations in the face of the Affordable Care Act. And they're thinking about their exam room utilization. And that was a somewhat new and unique problem to parts of the healthcare sector. But the reality is other parts of the economy had solved that problem, for decades, namely restaurants. And, as you think about turning a restaurant table versus turning an exam room, you come, you check in, you wait, you go to the bar, you sit in the waiting area, they take your vitals, you order your meal, you see your doctor, you eat, right? You sort of go through all the steps, and they're actually very similar. And turning a table and turning an exam room are almost, the steps are the same, even though what you're actually doing is different. One might be more or less pleasant than the other. But as you think about the types of careers you want to have in tech, which, a lot of times you're on the front end of creating a technology that's going to transform an industry, or you're in tech and some new upstart competitor comes and has it creates an existential threat to your business model, that is new to a lot of those types of companies. But when you come to a place like Bain Company that is 46 years into helping companies deal with disruptive innovation and transformational changes in their industry, you get down the learning curve of how to navigate that in a way that you just don't when you go to big tech. And for what we see is that a lot of folks will come to Bain and take on really interesting and important leadership positions at big tech, because the same turbulence that is new to a lot of executives in big tech is actually the same types of experience that we've trained our folks to deal with over their time at Bain. And so it really is a question of when do you want to focus, when do you want to specialize, and how prepared are you for the unexpected things that are going to happen in tech. And we think we prepare people for that career better than just going right in and doing it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. When you think about something you mentioned earlier, which is this idea that going into consulting after the MBA is kind of your PhD. And I always thought of it as, kind of like you're given a toolkit in business school. And then by going into consulting, you get a chance to actually like use everything in the toolkit. Whereas if you get siloed pretty quickly right out of school into a specific industry, you might not really get to use everything that you've learned. So I've always thought of it in those terms. Now, when I personally arrived at business school, I had a very limited understanding of like what people at Bain or any of the leading consulting firms do on a day in and day out basis. I knew that, they help companies solve problems, but I had a hard time kind of, understanding like, well, what does that really mean? And so I wanted to ask you for those listening who, maybe they're coming from a specific industry, they've never worked in consulting, but they know that it seems appealing as a post-MBA destination. Can you just walk me through like, what does a week look like for someone who's either interning or has just started a full-time post following an MBA? What does it look like to be at Bain? Like, how's your week layout? What are you doing with your time?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things we used to do in the on-campus presentations is, people say, I really want to understand what consulting does. And we say, well, think about the most important problems that senior executives solve. We help them work on the things that keep them up at night. And then there's just like this moment of silence where we just stare each other down, and they go, so I come into the office Monday morning, and what exactly do I do once I turn on my laptop? Right? And you're like, oh, you mean like, what are you actually going to do day to day? Got it. There are actually 3 aspects to the job that take up the majority of people's time. And they're, ironically, the 3 things that we test for in the interviews. They're the 3 buckets of things that you're evaluated on in your performance evaluations and so on and so forth. A big part of the job is cracking the case, and that is solving the problem that the client is facing. And that means that you're doing a fair amount of research on the question that you were asked. If you're thinking about, how do you make sure, if you're an airline company or an airline manufacturer, that your engineers are focused on high value added work, right? And you're thinking about, well, how am I going to figure that out? Well, I might actually want to do a survey of all the engineers and have them categorized over the course of a week where they were spending their time. And I'd like them to sort of tell me, how much of it is spent in meetings, how much of it is spent doing administrative work, how much of it is actually spent designing, how much of it is spent, just doing sort of unrelated tasks, but maybe helpful for the company, so that I can build that picture of their time. Another example might be if we're helping a pharma company launch a new drug or a gene therapy for a specific disease, I might actually want some people on the team to do some research and identify other companies that have had similar drugs or have launched drugs recently, and look at how their go-to-market strategy came to fruition. How did they think about building a sales force? How did they think about distribution? How did they think about their pricing model and their advertising and marketing model, all of those types of things? And so I might actually have people in both of those instances sort of coming in Monday morning and thinking about, well, what would I want to ask on the survey? And how would I take that survey and turn that into output that we can actually, develop actions on? Or in that second example, you might come in Monday and brainstorm as a team about companies that have had similar launches, or reaching out and identifying people at Bain who have done similar types of work and setting up calls with them to understand how it worked. And then you'd actually spend a good chunk of the time doing that research, making the phone calls, reading the articles, finding experts, talking to some of the medical providers to learn about it. So that's the upfront sort of launching the case, cracking of the problem parts of the work. That's a big part of what we do. We do work in teams, so there is this second part of how you spend your time, which is actually working with a team. Most teams are having weekly case team meetings where I'm sharing interim output, and I'm sharing, again, in that example, the draft of the survey questions and the output that I'm proposing, and I'm putting that out there for the team saying, this is how I'm planning on asking these questions. This is what I think I'll be able to say coming out of it. And people from the team at all levels, from the partner to the most junior person on the team, will sort of provide feedback on that and say, well, what if you showed it this way? Or what if you asked the question this way? Instead of asking people to rank them, what if you allocated 100 points across different things? That might give you a different level of insight into how they're spending their time. But you're actually working as a team to help each part of the team do their work as best they can. So we do a lot of our own sort of internal feedback. And you'll also have one-on-ones with your supervisor or with your direct reports. And then the third thing that we spend a lot of our time on is on engaging clients, right? And actually going out and saying, well, in your experience, you've been here a while. What happened the last time we launched? What went well? What didn't go well? You've also worked at other companies. What examples should I go to the market and look at? Let me share with you some of the interim output that I'm learning from this model that I built. Does this show the same types of things that you think based on your experience? If you had a magic wand, what would you change with this? And you're sort of continually iterating both with your own thinking on cracking the case, but working with the team and working with the client. And that process sort of happens continuously throughout the case. And you have interim milestones where you want sort of Rev 1 of the answer and then Rev 2 of the answer, so on and so forth. That's probably 90% of the time is spent doing things like that over the course of the week. Now, we also at Bain are really big on what we call extra 10%, which are, that 8th day of the week or that 25th hour of the day where you pursue some of your passion projects. And that is things like recruiting, things like training, or, organizing some of the office social activities or offsite activities, or, most offices have, community impact work going on, or other social events happening throughout the course of the year. And a lot of people at Bain, almost all of us, have some type of extra 10% activity that we do that keeps us connected to the firm beyond just cracking the case, working within teams, and working with clients. There's sort of a broader sort of commitment to making Bain the best place to work, which I think is what attracts a lot of people to Bain and keeps them really excited about working here.
So that makes sense. I guess one more practical question with respect to, how people are spending their time. Let's say I am, a part of a team working on a specific case with, a given company. Am I spending my time on site? Like, am I getting on an airplane every Monday or traveling to the site of the client and working with my team there? Am I working out of a Bain office? What in terms of just the practical logistics of all this? Am I on the road? Am I at a base? How does that sort of work out?
That's the $1 million question. I think everybody would love the crystal ball to understand what's the travel like. Here's what I would say. If I said an average of 2 to 3 days a week, everybody go, oh, cool. So that's 1 or 2 nights. And the reality is, well, some projects don't travel much at all. So that's 0. And some projects travel all the time. That's 4 or 5. So it averages to 2, but the project that you're on will dictate radically different experiences. What I would say is a couple of things that happen here. First of all, we're about doing what it takes to get results for our clients. And sometimes that requires you to be on site a lot, and other times it really doesn't, right? And so let me paint that illustration a couple of different ways. If you're doing a merger integration of 2 companies that merged, and they're trying to sort of, like a zipper, take the 2 cultures and create one culture from the 2 companies, that is the type of work that requires you to be on site and working hand in hand with the people from both sides that are building this new entity. And so on those types of projects, you might travel a lot. On the other hand, if you're doing potential acquisition work or you're working in our private equity group, a lot of times you're doing research on companies that might be acquired, and you're actually more interested in their position in the market. So you're not oftentimes working directly with the executives from those companies. So most of the time, our private equity group tends to work from the office exclusively, and sort of everything in between. What I would say about our model is, unlike other places, we travel to the client when we need to be on site for the client. And I've been on projects that have been 4 or 5 days a week, and I've been on projects where it's maybe a day or 2 a month. The most important thing is being there for the client so that you can get the results that you need. At Bain, and this is different than other places, we have a home office model. Whenever possible, we staff your team, manager on down, with people from your office. And joining an office at Bain & Company means that you're part of a community of people that's developing relationships with you and making sure that your professional development is on track and that you're hitting sort of the professional goals and ambitions that you wanted. But to your question, on a more practical note, that means that if we're on site at the client Monday through Thursday most weeks, but the Thursdays meetings were canceled, the team can actually go home Wednesday because we can have our case team meeting in the office because we're from the same office. And I think that's something that's often overlooked because, at other firms, when you're picking people from 6 different offices and they're all flying to a 7th city, the only way that team can meet in person is they might as well just be there every day, whether there's client meetings or not. And in our model, we're all from the same office. So if we don't have meetings on Monday, we can all fly out Tuesday and have that case team meeting in the office together. And while we're here, we can catch up with the mentors and mentees that we met during recruiting and that maybe we worked on with previous projects and all of that. So the travel model really does vary. But for us, it's more important that we focus less on, is it every day? Is it 3 days or 2 days? It's, are you there to get the results that you need at the end of the project? And different projects have different requirements.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that actually works well with another question I had for you, which is, we see on our website, people are often indicating schools that they're targeting as well as post-MBA employers. And for those who have an interest in consulting, they're constantly using this MBB acronym, which stands for, as you're well aware, McKinsey, Bain, BCG. And so those are the three firms that come up all the time. It sounds like you started offering up one point of differentiation, but I'm just curious how you would differentiate it, because I think one thing that we see a lot as well is people are often like, oh, I'm applying to Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford. And you and I both know, those are three MBA programs that are all, they're all superb, but they're also really different in terms of the experience that the student has. And yet they get lumped into a bucket of, well, these are the best, so I'm going to apply. And I think maybe the same could be said in this case, but I'd be curious to hear from you, like, what is it that makes Bain sort of different from McKinsey or BCG?
Well, first of all, I kind of have heard of MBB, but I think I've heard of BBM more, and I think it's Bain and the other two firms. I'm not sure if maybe we got our signals crossed there. I think that's what you meant.
Yes.
There's a couple of things that I do think differentiate Bain, and I encourage students to, first of all, at most of the top business schools, they have the opportunity to work with people in their classes and on projects from all three of the firms, of the BBM firms, and there's a couple of things that are tactical. The home office model, which I just described, is different, right? At Bain, you really do get the best of both worlds. You join an office, the people that you meet when you go out for Off-Free Weekend and during the recruiting process are actually the people that you're going to work with, because you're interviewing and you're meeting people from an office. That also means that your professional development is managed and supported by people that actually know you as an individual. They know your significant other. A lot of times, they know your children, they know your friends and all of that stuff, because you're actually sitting down across from the person who's helping you find the right project or writing your performance review. And it's more of a personal face-to-face relationship, not something that takes place over the phone or is remote, so to speak. But we're also an international firm. We have 57 offices in markets around the world, and you get to take advantage of that. We start you getting global experiences at Bain right from the beginning, right? You start and you go to training with your entire cohort globally in some really great cities around the world, and we make the investment to bring that cohort back together every 18 months or so. And so at Bain, you join a home office, but you're part of an international global firm, and you sort of get the sense of being part of a smaller community in a big firm, but you also get all the benefits of being in a big firm. That I think is a big part of it. The other difference, though, is the way that we think about supporting each other and the way we think about investing in each other. And it goes back to what I said earlier about wanting to win as a team, right? When you're growing the way we've grown over the time period that I've been at Bain, the only constraint on our growth as a firm is our ability to grow our manager team. Our unit of sale, if you will, is the case team, and every case team has a manager. And at Bain, we don't do a ton of hiring at the manager level, although we do from time to time. But at a lot of offices, they prefer to hire the best students out of bachelor's degree programs and MBA programs and PhD programs and grow them to be the future leaders of the firm. And so when I look at our growth of 15% over the last 26 years or so, to me, it's more than just we've been successful delivering results for the client, but we've also been successful at delivering on the value proposition for our people. Because the only way I can continue that growth is if I hire the best and I actually get them to realize their potential as leaders of the firm, get them to be managers. So those are some of the things that I think are different about the firm, and it feels different to work here because you get the sense that we want you to be successful, we want you to realize all of your potential, and it's part because we just, in our DNA, we want to see you succeed, but we also know that our growth as a firm depends on it. Now, on a more practical level, Graham, I think that a lot of times when I was in business school, I could listen to the way people approach problems in class and understand the firm that they worked for before business school. And, in some situations, the way they think about changing an organization would be convincing the CEO and going down further in the organization and saying, this is what the boss told us to do, and we're going to listen to her and get this done. And in other situations, they sort of do a lot of homework and research and build some esoteric model and thought pieces, and they convince the leadership team this is what they want to do, and they go forth into the organization and say, well, we've thought about this a lot, and here's what the answer is because we've thought about it a lot and we're really smart. And what I've experienced at Bain is we'll do all the heavy lifting, we'll do all of the research and leverage all the experience of the global firm, and we'll get the leadership team on board. But Bain people actually want to go out to the field and throughout the organization and say, this is what we think the answer is. Based on your experience, tell us where this falls short. Tell us what we're missing here. And the people and the difference in the way that they think about driving change is less about top down or I'm smarter than you. It's a lot more, we will get the best answer if we leverage all of our expertise and experience with all of your experience and expertise. And there's a certain respect for the organization that Bain people have that is different. And you can perceive that as you're sitting in class and hearing the way your classmates approach problems. And then, it's kind of funny to say, but when you see two Bain people meet each other on any business school campus, when they didn't know each other before and they realized they both worked at Bain, there's that instant connection. And I hear it all the time from students, and they say, I noticed that. Like two Bain people in my section or my study group realized they both worked at Bain, and then all of a sudden it was like they were lifelong friends, even though I know they just met 5 minutes ago. And that speaks to the type of culture that we have here. We're not sort of an alumni factory, just sort of hiring people, getting them 2 years of experience and sending them on their way. We actually, are building a family of people that are all in it for everybody's mutual success and our client's success.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. One of the other things that's really important to folks on our site is they're in the throes of applying to schools, and many of them, they applied early this season, for example. They've got admits in hand from some of the best MBA programs on the planet. And I know when I had an admit in hand from a few schools, my main focus was, okay, I'm going to finish out my a couple more months of work, and then where am I going to go travel before business school starts? But it seems like today people are a little bit more career kind of focused, and they're sort of already thinking about like, okay, I know I want to do consulting. How can I like sort of get on Bain's radar even before I show up on campus? And I know there are a couple of kind of factors to consider here. One is which, the schools themselves are not so keen on candidates starting recruiting before they show up, let alone, when they first show up either, because schools have, kind of rules in place where they want the class to gel and have kids come on campus. And so recruiting doesn't typically start, or it's not really allowed until October or something, right? So, but yet on the other hand, you have on the market side of it, the candidates are kind of saying, we want to learn more about Bain or whoever it is. And how can we, so let's imagine that, one of our listeners has an offer, maybe they're headed off to your alma mater, HBS or something, and they already know like, wow, I really want to learn more about Bain. What's available to them? How can they reach out, or are there things that they should be doing? Are there pre-MBA internships or ways to get a head start with respect to the summer internship recruiting process for between years 1 and 2 of the MBA? So what's available to them?
So first of all, it is, I think, more of a trend than it was when I was coming out of school to see people trying to do things early and trying to do that pre-MBA internship and all of that. And it's almost like they're looking for the microwave version of their professional development. And that, I think there has to be an acknowledgement that that's just not the way this works, right? You can't, if you need to marinate a steak, you can't marinate it in 5 minutes because you have a special process. It's actually, you got to put in the time. And I think taking the time out to get a top tier MBA is a 1 to 2 year commitment, because it takes 1 to 2 years to get what it is you want out of it. And so I would start by just saying, there are no shortcuts, and you can rush it, but you're not going to get the same out of different experiences as if you sort of trust the process and trust that the money you're investing in some of these programs that have been around doing really great things for a really long time, they actually know what they're doing, and they're bringing you along a well laid course and a plan that gets you where you need to be at the end of the program. So let me start by just acknowledging that the top business schools in the world are the top business schools in the world for a reason, and there's a level of trust that you should make that I think should be implicit in the investment that you're making to go there in the first place. So, okay, now that I've got the formalities out of the way, what I would say is early education is fine. And we talk with all of the business schools about the dynamic that you described, because what they're looking for is they want students to get full advantage out of the experience of going to business school and taking a moment to hit pause on their work and reflect on their strengths, reflect on their development opportunities, and really think about what type of person they want to be 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and what's the right career to get them to those goals. And I fully appreciate the fact that they do that. Now, what that means is they don't want you starting off the business school program already committed to something before you really have taken advantage of all the opportunities that you can see. It's sort of like walking into a buffet and piling on the salad because that's the first station, and then by the time you get to the end, you're like, wow, I really would have liked to have saved room for dessert. And so you don't want to jump at the first thing before you've had a chance to look at the whole buffet. Right? Pro tip, when you go to a big buffet, make sure you walk the whole line before you start piling on your plate. Right? And so in this context, I think that the pre-MBA experiences should really be about education and learning what's out there. It's not about early recruiting, but it is about early education. And we do a bunch of things at Bain, and we put them under the umbrella called Experience Bain. And we have sort of 5 different planks of the Experience Bain program, and you can find more about it on the website. But quickly, there's Experience Bain Global, which all of our offices around the world will host a webinar for students that are interested in working and learning more about what Bain is doing in a particular market. There's Experience Bain Diversity, which is a 1 or 1.5 day program, depending on the one you join, where you get a chance to see how Bain thinks about diversity, how we approach the work, and its targeted outreach to improve the diversity of the firm. There's Experience Bain Tech. There's the Experience Bain Women's Summit. There's Experience Bain Veterans. And what we're doing is we're creating opportunities for people to get a sense of who we are as a firm, but recognizing that a lot of those are pre-MBA. We also spend a little bit of time talking about what is consulting and what is Bain doing in consulting. And then we show them examples of the work. We put them on panel discussion, or they get exposure to panel discussions of people who just started at Bain, how they thought about the recruiting process, some more experienced people, leaders at the firm, talking about the career journey and where Bain is headed. And we have all of those things for MBA students. We also do a similar set of activities, Curious About Consulting and Advantage, that we do for advanced degree students. But the idea is we have all of those things happening so students can learn a lot more. I think what's interesting, though, Graham, is that 25 to 30% of the people that participate in those types of events, the Experience Bain events, go, wow, that was really amazing. Bain does really great work. I want no part of that after graduating. Right? And what's great about that is, when they get to campus and they start thinking about where to invest the limited time that they have in October once the recruiting season starts for first years, a lot of times they go, wow, that was good, but I don't think I'm going to follow the herd into consulting. I'm actually going to go do something else. I know what that is, and I know that that's not a good fit for what I want to do. And for me, that's a great outcome too. They're not wasting their time. They're not wasting our time. They're focusing on what it is that they really want to get out of the business school experience. So it's a win-win either way, whether they come out interested or come out not interested.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And yeah, just to be clear, I think our audience on the site I don't think they're contemplating foregoing business school, but I think they're just, and again, this is so odd to me just because it wasn't the case when I was in business school, but I think they're just trying to kind of get their ducks in a row and think they're already thinking about like sort of, okay, I'm in to Harvard or whatever school it is, Wharton, and I'm already thinking about, okay, how can I just better equip myself to get into consulting or whatever it is they're interested in. So they're just starting the process earlier. But I feel like they see the value in the degree. I know, they're committed. It just, there's just lots of questions on our site from our audience about, how can they kind of make sure they're doing everything. And I guess what I'm hearing from you pretty loud and clear is, educate yourself on what's out there and take advantage of these different events that you all organize and just learn and view it as a learning process.
Yeah, and the early recruiting that I was referring to is I think there are some places that will run those pre-MBA summer programs and give offers at the end of those programs. And so those students show up on campus, already knowing what they're going to be doing the following summer. All of the people that participate in our Experience Bain programming, whether it's Experience Bain Global, Diversity, Tech, Women's, Veterans, they're all committed and they all see the value in going back to business school. What we're trying to do in those programs, though, is educate them as to what we're about and how we're differentiated from the other firms they're considering, so that when summer associate, summer internship recruiting starts in October, they already know we're their top choice to work. Yeah, what does them an injustice, and I think what the schools are most concerned about, having talked to several of them, is when students make that commitment before they've had a chance to see everything. And that's what I'm calling early recruiting. But early education, the schools are very supportive of.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we could probably do an entire podcast on this kind of early recruiting subject, but we'll kind of move on. I have a question about, this is kind of a very specific question, but we always hear that, some consulting firms use GMAT scores or maybe GRE scores or even your undergraduate GPA when they're kind of starting to look at your profile. And so I know, there are candidates who think that by taking these tests and getting into business school, they've kind of put that behind them. And then they get into the recruiting process for a consulting firm and they're like, oh no, I have to dig out those scores again. Like I thought I was done for life, with this stuff. And you even see cases, some conversations happen on our site in the community where people are like, my score was good enough to get me into school, but should I retake in case, having like 20 more points on the test would make me more attractive to a consulting firm or whoever's, recruiting. So tell me a little bit, like, how do you use these things? Do you use GMAT scores, GRE? Because the GRE seems to be increasingly, in use and in play for business schools. So tell me a little bit about some of the metrics that you might use on the kind of intellectual horsepower end of the recruiting process.
Right. Well, honestly, I think nothing speaks to your potential as a future business leader like a recommendation from your kindergarten teacher. But which I think is where things are headed if you read enough.
Yes.
If you read enough of the online forums.
Yes.
Kidding aside, at the consultant recruiting level, I do think that all of the schools that we're recruiting at are highly selective in the students that they admit to their programs, and so in most cases, getting admitted to that school in some ways is sort of the Noah's Ark flood, if you will. Nothing before the flood matters as much. If your GMAT score is a little bit lower than what we typically see, I'm going to trust that one of the top 5 business schools in the country saw enough other potential in you that they were okay with it. And, if INSEAD, if Harvard, if Wharton, if Kellogg, if Booth, if Sloan, if they were okay with your GMAT where it is and thought that you deserved to have the honor of being in their program, being one of their alumni someday, I'm not sure that I'm going to question that, because I know the caliber of students that are applying and I know that they chose you. And so I think there has to be an acknowledgement right off the top that says, if that school thought you were good enough when they looked at the whole package and they're looking at a lot more data and a lot more detail and a lot more history than I'm going to see at a presentation or in a 40-minute interview, I probably should trust them. And we do. And so I do think that the GMAT score is important in the sense that if it's too low, questions might come up about your ability to sort of keep pace with the analytically rigorous environment that you're going to be working in. But again, that tends not to be the case at most of the schools. You mentioned GRE and some of the other tests that were on there. We do look at GRE. We do a lot of PhD recruiting, and it's gotten actually a lot more important as a channel for us over the last couple of years. And there's some online things that you can do to convert that to a GMAT equivalent so that people understand sort of what the different scores are. I took the GRE when I was coming out of when I was going into graduate school, so I actually had both. But generally speaking, the way people should think about it is your GMAT score is your GMAT score. Right before this call, I actually was emailing with a recruit that was concerned about their ACT scores. He was applying to one of our undergraduate programs. And I said, look, it is what it is. You can't go back and change it. So put it in the context of your overall package. And let's focus on that. And the same is true for GMAT scores. At the end of the day, I have done the analysis because back in the day I was an AC and I got curious, an associate consultant, and I got curious what it would actually say. And we don't see a super high correlation between GMAT score and long-term success at Bain. We just don't. We do know that there are fewer people here with lower GMAT scores, But that's also a function of the fact that we recruit from places that don't have a lot of people with low GMAT scores. so what, I'm not sure exactly what insight we expected to get from that analysis. But, the idea that you should take it again to get an extra 20 points is probably just going to cost you a couple $100 and a lot of anxiety. And it's probably not worth it. I think there's a lot more to be gained by learning more about the nuances and the difference of the firms and preparing for your interview process, and frankly, getting the most you can out of the investment you're making in business school and not living in what you did 2 or 3 years ago and trying to eke out an extra 10 points. That's not a good use of anybody's time. And at the end of the day, we're not going to care enough that 10, 20, 30 points is going to make a big difference.
Yeah, okay. That's great. And that actually dovetails right into the next question, which I had, which is about the recruiting process. You kind of alluded to maybe, it might behoove someone to spend more time learning about Bain and learning about the case interview or the way that you guys recruit, as opposed to like eking out an extra 10 or 20 points on a standardized test. So tell me a little bit about the process. If I remember correctly, you guys have, for most of the kind of MBA recruiting, there's sort of 2 interviews that take place on campus. And I think they're both case interviews, but I think some of our audience may not even really understand exactly what a case interview is. So I don't know if you can give us the the 1 minute kind of summary on what is a case interview and how does your process sort of work?
Sure. So the process itself typically is 2 rounds of interviews. It's usually 2 first-round interviews that are both case interviews. And in the second round, there's usually about 3 interviews. 2 of them are cases, and 1 of them is an experience interview. We'll talk through your resume and your career progression and try and understand how Bain fits into your longer-term career goals. Just, frankly, why are you interviewing with Bain? And most people aren't surprised by things on their resume, but a lot of times you'd be surprised. People forget to review their resume before they come in for that interview, and you'll bring something up and they'll go, what are you talking about? And you're like, well, it says right here, you did this. And they're like, oh, yeah, my bad. The case interview themselves are, the interview slots tend to be about 35, 40 minutes. The case discussion is probably 20 to 25 minutes. And what that is that's typically the interviewer from their own case experience crafting or setting the stage for a business problem that's facing a particular company, and then talking through that with the candidate. And so I might say, there's a merger that took place. I actually worked on a project like this, and we're looking at all the different synergies that could be realized as part of the merger. And it turns out both companies have a small fleet of private jets, and they want to figure out how many they should have, or should they just get rid of the whole fleet and fly commercial. In case interview prep land, that's a classic make versus buy example, but we're just going to talk through that. And we're just going to talk through the business problem so that I can see how you would think about it. So that if I give you a little bit of data, how can you use that data and, maybe calculate some savings, calculate some different options, and make a recommendation on what you would do if you were in charge of the company. But at its best, it should feel more like 2 people discussing a business problem, and just not that you would necessarily do that with with your friends on the weekend, but the cadence and the view of it. It's not a quiz, it's not a test. We're not hazing you. We're just going to come in and talk about this problem so I can see how you would think about it. There's actually a lot of really great information on our website that gives you some insight into sort of things like good, better, best answers, or how to structure the case. And then during the summer, we also do some case prep webinars. I led one last year, and I think we had several hundred students dialed in just listening. So there are several opportunities out there for people who are curious what the case interview is like, and they can even see some examples on our website. The very last thing that I would say for your audience is that preparing for case interviews is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. In my business school class, I actually verified this story with these guys at our reunion, our 15th reunion a couple of years ago. There were 4 military guys in my section at HBS that all wanted to do consulting, but they had no sort of business background. What they decided to do is in September, October, they would just start meeting every Saturday for breakfast. And the 4 of them met. One would give a case, one would receive, while the other 2 ate. And then when those 2 were done eating, one would give a case, the other would receive while the first 2 ate. And then they'd break and meet again next week. And they did that every week during the fall. And come January, they all had consulting offers, right? I think a bad approach is to say, I'm going to take the 3 weeks over the holiday break and I'm going to do 5 cases a day. It was 1 a week over a month or 2, and they were all fine. And that's probably a better approach, because I think students forget that you're also learning relevant skills in your classes, and you just can't accelerate that. You have to let the process play out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like, there were a lot of support systems on campus at Wharton, and that remains the case. And I'm sure it's true at all the leading schools in terms of just, getting exposure to how to sort of talk through a case. And so I would recommend our listeners avail themselves. And it sounds like on your website, they can just go, to Bain? Is it Bain.com? I can't remember your exact URL, but they'll find it.
Yep, you can go to bain.com/careers, and you can look under some of the interview prep materials that are there. And there's a lot of things online. What I find is that the online resources and some of the books that are out there are great to give you some familiarity, but there's no substitute for practicing out loud with someone else. And at places like Wharton and other top schools, there's always former summer interns that are in the second year class ahead of you. And a lot of times at those schools, there's other first years that were working in consulting before. Those are the people that you want to practice with out loud. Just like looking at I was an engineering major, and I always looked at the answer key after the test, and I was like, well, of course, how else would you do that? But you look at your test and realize, well, there's apparently at least one other wrong way to do it. And it always sounds great in your head when you're reading case prep materials and preparing, and it oftentimes sounds crazy when you say it out loud. So it's really important that you practice out loud with somebody and just get used to verbally talking through what you're working on. But there's lots of resources in the ecosystem, if you will, on most campuses.
Yeah, and I would say one word of advice, which hopefully you'll back me up on, don't try to guess what the case is in terms of the companies that are involved. So this actually, speaking from personal experience, I interviewed with one of your competitors when I was at Wharton, and I happened to have read an article that was exactly about what this person was talking to me about, and I just knew right away, like, what the company was. And I said, oh, you're talking about X. And the woman just looked at me like, it was like the one thing you're not supposed to do. Of course, I had no idea, right? But, and things ended up working out. But it was just like, this moment of absolute, like, you're not supposed to guess what the company is. That's secret, So anyway, piece of advice.
Yeah, it is funny. The interviews themselves, like I said, it's a 20 to 25 minute discussion of a business problem. The airline example, the corporate jet example I gave earlier was literally a 1-week work stream for an associate consultant on a project that I was on with 4 or 5 other people for a year. And so even if you think you know the specific situation, it is so summarized and abbreviated so that it can be an effective case interview that your interviewer can almost take it, 5, 6, 7, 12 notches further down the road if you think notch 1, 2, and 3 because you read it in an article. So it's just not a good use of your time. You're absolutely right. Just focus in the moment and have a discussion. And that's definitely going to be more successful than spending a lot of brain power trying to think about, I wonder what company that is.
Yeah. Okay, so
I'm glad it worked out though.
So I have a couple of 2 sort of rapid fire kind of questions. They're both kind of myth busting questions I had for you. So the first one is, I've heard if you don't do your summer internship with Bain, that or really any top consulting firm, that it's much harder to then get a job as a second year MBA student when you do recruiting for a full-time role post MBA. Is that true?
Parts of it. So here's what I would say. First of all, we do second year recruiting because our growth demands it. Last summer we had our largest summer class in the history of the firm, and I still needed to go back to campus in the second year and find more people to fill the demand for Bain case teams. And so we are doing second year recruiting because we're growing and we just can never meet all of our growth requirements from a summer class. What I will say is that if you have an offer from Bain & Company and you turn us down to go to one of our competitors, then your path recruiting into Bain from campus has pretty much, you've made your decision. What we do see is people who will say, I really think I want to work at Bain, but I have this startup idea that I want to pursue, or there's a part of the country, or I really want to work in the social impact sector for the summer. And that's great. And we see a lot of people take advantage of the business school summer to scratch an itch that they probably had that led them to business school in the first place. And they come back and they recruit in the second year, and we're happy to have them. But I do think that it's important that students who have an offer from Bain & Company and are considering us versus some of the other firms that they're considering take that very seriously, because we certainly do.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Okay, and then the last question I had is, there's also this kind of notion out there that if you don't go to a kind of top MBA program, and even what we often hear this term called like core schools, that consulting firms have core schools at which they recruit from, and that if you're not at one of those schools, you're kind of out of luck. And so I just, let's imagine for a moment that I've been accepted at some of the really great schools, whether it's what we call an M7 school, like a Columbia or a Kellogg or, even a Wharton or Harvard. But that I get, a full scholarship offer to go to a school that's maybe, a top 15 school or outside of the realm of the programs that you guys are kind of on the ground doing heavy recruiting from. Is there a path for me to get to Bain? And if so, like what are the best ways? Do I just go to your website, or are there certain things to do if you're at a school that maybe isn't a school that's, as frequented by Bain?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I know it's on a lot of people's minds. I'm going to answer it two different ways. One of them might be a little bit more of a smart aleck way to answer it, but the first answer would be that my team directly runs multiple events and quite frankly, very scale campus programs at about 15 different schools, 15, 16 schools. Bain Company actively recruits on probably 25 to 30 campuses in any given year. Okay. And so the stack, we actually go, very deep into the stack looking for all the best talent that we can find. I think when you get outside of the top 20 or so programs, the programs get a lot smaller. So my class at HBS was probably 950 students, and some of the places we recruit now have MBA programs of 120 students. And so what you don't see is the same type of, massive on-campus presence because, at a school with 100 people, 50 don't want to do consulting, and of the other half that's left, some of them probably shouldn't do consulting, and you just get to very small numbers that make it challenging, which is why for us, Experience Bain has been so great because it's a way to use technology to get those connections and find those students. And every year we're recruiting from a wide variety of campuses. The last time I pulled the data was probably a year and a half ago, and our incoming consultant class had MBAs from 60 different programs globally represented in it. And so there's certainly, the answer to your question is a resounding absolutely. There are paths into Bain from all types of programs. But, specifically, if you're thinking of a top 15, top 20 program, you're probably going to be fine either way. We know that the top students in all of those programs would be the top students in any one of the other programs. The smart aleck answer that immediately popped into mind is at some level there's a math exercise that takes place that says, what are your career options going to a top 5 or top 10, or as you refer to the M7, business schools, and what are the types of jobs that you can get from those programs, and what do those jobs pay? They publish those all on their website, and you can do the same for the program that you would go to at a slight discount because of the money that they're offering you. And consider that case interview round zero. When you do that math, which one makes the most sense? You're going to take 2 years off to make a very big investment of your own time, no matter where you are, and you have to take full advantage of that to get the most out of the time that you're going to invest. And if that comes from a top program and you pay a little bit more, but you have better upside on the back end, that's something you should take really seriously.
Yes, and we kind of preach that on the website quite a bit in terms of, just encouraging people to really think about like, well, what's your career plan and what is your, what are you likely to be earning post-MBA? Because, when you're trying to decide where to attend based on a little bit of financial aid, it's easy to kind of get lost and not think about the very long term. So yeah, we encourage the same line of thinking. So you've been incredibly generous with your time. I have one more kind of surprise question, and it's more of a personal question. We do this thing on the site called Real Humans, where we talk to admissions directors at leading schools, we talk to current students, and we always ask people just like, what's kind of something that you enjoy doing that has nothing to do with your job, or just something, a personal thing that you're passionate about. So I would be remiss if I didn't just ask you, is there something that you do with your probably with somewhat limited spare time, but is there something that you love doing that you'd like to share with our audience?
There are 24 hours in the day, and I like to get the most out of every single one of them, whether it's with my 2 teenage boys, a high school senior, high school sophomore, or my wife. We're coming up on our 21st anniversary in a couple of weeks. So I have plenty of things that we like to do as a family and as a couple. But most of the people who know me and have met me know that I am very passionate about photography, and I take advantage of more or less every business trip that I can around the world to bring my camera and maybe add a day or duck out for a couple of hours and explore different cultures and different parts of different cities. I like to get off the beaten path and get out of the touristy areas and document the world through my lens. And I take advantage of that pretty much every trip that I can. And it's a great way to blend it's a great way to blend the passion that I have for work with some of the passions I have outside of work. It's at the end of the day, it's not about work-life balance. It's about doing the work in a way that adds to your overall happiness as a person. And I've been able to do that at Bain for 23 years and counting.
Yeah, terrific. Well, thanks for sharing something personal. I know our audience always likes that kind of thing. And again, thank you so much for taking the time, Keith. It's been a pleasure having you. And yeah, stay tuned. We have a lot of great guests on this show, including we did a show not too long ago with Chad Losi, who's the director of admissions at HBS, which people should tune into. You probably know Chad. So yeah, so thanks again for your time. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here and look forward to keeping in touch.
Stay tuned, everyone, for the next episode. And as always, thanks for rating and reviewing this podcast on iTunes. And again, this has been the Cleared Mid MBA Admissions Podcast. We'll see you next time.